People keep sleeping on the Chinese wilderness poets, and it's been 1,500 years. People would rather read book talk poetry fluff than engage with some of the most eco-conscious writers of all time. Today, poetry has been flooded by a bunch of people who are projecting modern consciousness onto nature and extracting words, stanzas, and marrow from the earth to exploit it in their poems. Because, for instance, the Chinese wilderness poets spent decades, if not their whole life, as recluses in nature, writing thousands and thousands of haikus and poems and connecting and meditating. How are we ever going to compete with that? Can we restore ourselves from the technological virus that infects us and capture some of the depth and some of the magic that the Chinese poets bring to the table? Because with their silent minimalism, it transcends a lot of the base emotions, and it creates a syntax where the poet doesn't have to explain emotions. If we look at Rilke in the early 19th century, Rilke and Proust, they cracked open the unconscious and the huge depth within our mind. And with that, we got emotions and multiple personalities and the fragmentation of consciousness, or at least the discovery of that fragmentation. The Chinese wilderness poets mended that fragmentary consciousness by, first of all, having nothing to create dualism with. If you have no society, if you have no technology, if you only have an education and literacy, but you move away from that for decades and only maintain that for self-discovery, not for profit, not for intellectual growth or to find the truth of life, then that creates a certain growth. And if you spend thousands, if you spend decades out in nature, of course you're going to solve a lot of those problems that fragmentary consciousness has, a fragmented consciousness, a person who hasn't sorted through their unconscious. Because if you spend, the unconscious, if there's a great book called The Discovery of the Unconscious, and in that book it tracks back to the East and German idealism, how the unconscious has been a concept forever. Freud and his mentor didn't invent it. It's been known about, especially in the East, for thousands of years. It just wasn't turned into a scientific model because it had to be turned into a science because we had, with the start of the 20th century, there was so much sickness and so many problems because of the Industrial Revolution and modern warfare that people needed psychotherapy. And so it was the intellectual community responded to the people's needs. And we see that all the time, But that's what monks of all religions were doing. They were sifting through the unconscious. And when you come out of that, because a lot of these great Chinese wilderness poets in Japan, if you look at Basho, they were old. So, think of where you're at right now. Think if you had the time in decades, if you never worked, or if you maybe worked a little bit, because there are different types of Chinese wilderness poets, for instance. A lot of the great ones actually didn't start writing until their 40s or 50s. They would go through, the Chinese education system and then get a government or high position in society because, the literacy rates were kind of low back then. So a lot of these Chinese wilderness poets had a very classic upbringing or somehow, learned language through whatever means. So some of them, the typical process is they would work until 40, 50, or 60. And then after they had raised their families and taking care of all their matters, they would retire to die, for however long it took into nature, and they would write poetry. And there's so many poets that we don't even know about who did this, and never, their works never got back to us. There was a tradition with Basho in Japan that he would write, all these poems and would leave them. That's how we have a lot of them, is that he would be leaving them and people would be pulling them together and trying to get them. And because when we go out into society right now, I never get a positive message. All I see is billboards and advertisements and products that I don't need, but they are telling me that I need. And I live in a society where I see rich and poor and scared. When was the last time you out in the world, saw a poem or saw a positive message that was written by someone for you to take, and then maybe you write one and leave one there? These things don't necessarily happen. The closest thing that we have in the literary community to that is people starting those libraries on the road where you take one, give one, whatever. But conceivably, those aren't enough to actually create change. That's what we're doing here. That's why I'm talking to you right now, is that the online medium, it sucks, I can't and that's what's really cool, is that the Chinese wilderness poets decided that it's a very Taoist point of view that and there a lot of them were Taoists, that I don't have to connect or change anything out in the world. That there's all these world problems. Like, here I am. The main message on this channel is always I'm going to change the world with literature and do this. They would laugh at that, and they would say, the main thing you can do is discover beauty and connect. You can't stop this. The virus is moving. And, I don't know if I believe in that, but there's a whole school of poetry that, that has come about that says you shouldn't write political poems because it ruins the beauty. And the silent minimalism of the Chinese wilderness poets isn't very marketable today. You can't walk up to someone with a low attention span and, and tell them, hey, and no connection to nature, like, hey, we got to see this. This is so intense. And I've seen this happen so many times because I'm either delusional, but a lot of my favorite poets and a lot of people have been inspired by the Chinese wilderness poets. The whole generations with the White Pony Chinese translations, there's a lot of newer ones. There's this translation, I think it was called White Pony, by White Pony or something. And there was this whole book of Chinese translations. And all the modernists and the late modernists, Robinson Jeffers, Marion Moore, Mary Oliver, Robert Bly, the Norwegians, Robinson Jeffer, Olaf Hogg, those are just some people that are very famous who I know were very inspired by the Chinese wilderness poets. Donald Hall, Richard Wright, if I'm remembering his name, James Wright. But how are you going to sell this type of poetry to people? I show my kids, or I've shown students and friends and colleagues Chinese wilderness poetry, and I say like, hey, what do you guys think of this? And I think it's some of the best poetry ever written. Li Po, Cold Mountain, Fa Shu, and they never seem to like it. They like the emotive. They like what Rilke brought to the table. They're so deep into their mind, and they think too much. They are thinking too much about all the wrong things, and there's all these expectations with social media and other things and technology. And with the lowering of the attention span and the decline of a connection with nature, which is the big one, that's actually the big one, is that they can't like this poetry because they've never had a spiritual experience with nature because they haven't spent enough time there. A spiritual experience with nature either happens if you never spend any time there and then you go out there and you're overwhelmed, but once that overwhelming feeling is over, then you have to sit with it. And a lot of people haven't spent the years sitting with it. And, unless you were raised out on a farm or doing these things, then it's almost like a muscle that you have to keep working. But you really only have to do it once. If you can connect once, then you can understand that silent minimalism that the Chinese poets bring. So for writers today, is it really marketable? I'm really thinking about launching an eco-poetry course, just like a quick run, not a quick run through, but the selling point would be in 8 weeks, we're going to write and publish an eco-poetry book because there's thousands of poetry books getting released every month, if not more. And a lot of them have zero focus on nature. And my thought is that even if we write in pseudonyms, if we're just writing haikus and releasing things with great titles and great covers and throwing that out there and, making sure it's obviously good, of good quality. And there's methods, there are ways to create great poetry and great wilderness poetry that we can, start to shift the market a little bit. Because if we don't put these books out there, if we don't have these relics, like I said, even if it's under a pen name, then we'll never win the battle. There are less wilderness poets and people who are able to do this every single year. And that's why you see all these climate change poets now where people, they don't know how to do it. They don't know what to talk about. Wilderness poetry has nothing to do with climate change. You can talk about death and violence and the destruction of nature. Those things are fine. But when the poetry is surrounding that and you can't get away from that and you can't make great poetry just talking about images through images and a little bit of self-reflection, then you're not a real wilderness poet. And go look at any eco-poetry anthology that's been released in the last 10 or 20 years, and you'll see no inspiration from the Chinese wilderness poets. And they are the goats of this. They are the best. No one did it. If we look at history, if we look at, the English-speaking language, Beowulf a little bit, we got a little bit of Beowulf, and then by the time that Chaucer comes around, he might have a little bit, but then we go through a total decline until the Germans like Novalis and Hölderlin and Goethe and others started to bring nature back in, and William Blake bring nature back into modern consciousness. And obviously it had a revolution with the modernists like Pound, Williams, T.S. Eliot, and obviously the other modernists, and especially the Spanish symbolists. The Spanish symbolists were great at nature. Lorca, Machado, Jimenez, so many great poets. So I am inspired to post more about eco-philosophy, eco-poetry, eco-literature on this channel. That's how this channel actually started. If you guys are new, I have this whole thing called the Spiritual Ecology Course. That's still a work in progress. It's a free course. I'll leave a link here to go check that out. If you guys want to check out the first video in that series, it's a great breakdown of one of my favorite books, Becoming Animal. You guys can check that out right here. Peace.